All right, well, welcome everybody. There's a lot of folks online, so I'm talking to the folks in the room. It's a little weird, but there are people out there in the stratosphere. So tonight we're in the third of our series, the Chestnut Street Sessions, which is a series of community conversations about disability and building inclusive communities. And tonight we're going to be talking about guardianships and less restrictive alternatives. So I'm not going to say a lot in introduction. I'm going to take you through a series of questions to explore our own views on decision making. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but I'll take you through some questions first, and then we'll talk about it. And then we'll talk a little bit about what a guardianship is, how they operate, and what some of the alternative options are. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about how school plays into this and transition from being school age to adult, and how that goes into the decision-making process. So we're going to be using an online service called Mentimeter tonight, which allows us to ask questions and have real-time responses from the audience. And I don't know if anybody in the audience needs a device, but if you got a phone in your pocket, you'll be able to use it. Otherwise, I've got a couple of extra devices if anybody wants one. So I will pause here for a second to see if anybody needs a device. Otherwise, looking good. So going to the next slide. Hopefully this works. Are you able to advance the slides? Oh, that's just slow. Okay, we can go to the next slide. There we go. So those are the instructions. So if you just take out your device and scan that QR code, or you can go to www.menti.com, and you'll just see an entry for the code for this session, which is 4441-4861. Again, you're going to go to www.menti.com and enter the code 441-4861. I see some folks are giving the thumbs up there, so it looks like people are getting it. So we'll give it a few minutes just to make sure everybody was able to log in there. I'm still seeing some people coming into the room. And that login information will be at the top of the slide. So if you get kicked out, you'll see it at the top of the slides. You just go back to menti.com 441-4861. Okay. So the first question we've got is what choices did you make for yourself today? You want to use one of our devices, that'd be fine. Oh, okay. Oh, great. Okay. We've got some responses trickling in. Okay, we'll give it another 10 seconds or so. And I'm just going to read some of the responses just to make sure if anybody can't see the screen. So some of the responses to the question, what choices did you make for yourself today, are food, shopping. Another person said food, my plans for the evening, what to eat, what to wear, what projects to work on, and in what order, what to wear, what to eat for breakfast, what time to leave for work, what to have for lunch, walking, exercise, what to eat, how to get to work, what to wear today, what time I got up, what I ate, what I did with my time. Next question. I need help making decisions about blank. And this is an open-ended question like the last one, so you can just put in as many as responses as you wish. I need help making decisions about blank. Give it another 10 seconds or so. We've still got a few responses trickling in. So some of the responses here to I need help making decisions about blank are fixing my car, finances, investments, life, what vehicle to buy, what medical procedures to undergo, what bills to pay, child pickup, drop-off coordination, my finances, career, finances, legal, what technology to purchase when old devices break, taxes, making large purchases, investing. Next question. In what areas of life do you feel comfortable making some decisions but not others? In what areas of life do you feel comfortable making some decisions but not others? And again, this is an open-ended question. You can put in as many responses as you wish. Give it a few more seconds here. Okay, we've got some folks who just joined us. If you have a device, a mobile device, you can go to menti.com and log in there, or I can set you up on one of these computers too, if you prefer. Um, Looks like we had a few. So some of the responses here, in what areas of life do you feel comfortable making some decisions about others? Some folks said what to wear, mental health, exercise, healthcare, child's future. Lots of people said relationships, finances, medical, purchasing a car, IRA contributions, or retirement account contributions. I'm not sure. Career, cooking, finance, and insurance. The bigger words are things that came up more frequently. Give us an example of an area you're comfortable making some decisions, but not others. What's an area where you're comfortable making some decisions, but not others? Some decisions alone, but not, sorry, let me read that question again. Give us an example of an area where you're comfortable making some decisions alone, but not others. So some of the responses here, give us an example of an area you're comfortable making some decisions alone, but not others. Folks said finances, politics, career, household purchases, financial investments and savings, retirement, big issues at work, investing, taking out a loan, finances, purchasing a car, being a good parent, medical, responding to my children's needs and questions. Who helps you make decisions in your life? Great. So some of the responses, who helps you make decisions in your life? A lot of people said spouse, friends, doctor, accountant, financial professional, my coworkers, my primary doctor, my therapist, a parent, the community, an adult child, my children. Several people said my child or children. Anyone's a caregiver. I think we captured all those there. When you need help making a decision, how do you communicate with your supporters or the people who help you make decisions? Give it a few more seconds here. Okay, some of the responses there. When you need help making a decision, how do you communicate with your supporters? Talking in person or over the phone, speaking face to face, in person, by phone or text. I ask if they have time to talk. I text in-person conversations. I ask for help verbally and through ongoing dialogue. Text, in person, verbally request help. Okay. Name some things you want that you spend money on each month. Name some things you want that you spend money on each month. So some of the responses here are food, yoga, candy, PlayStation cards, Starbucks, mochas, books, travel, groceries, coffee, gym membership, and Legos. Oh, I went. Sorry, I skipped this one, but it's okay. We can go back. Name some things you need that you spend money on each month. Got a few more trickling in, so we'll give it another few seconds. So some of the responses to name some things you need that you spend money on each month are food, health insurance, medications, housing and heat, gas, electricity, food, groceries, water, rent, groceries and utilities, gas for my car, mortgage, healthcare, and car payment. And we did that one, so we'll go back. Next question, and this is a yes or no question. Do you have access to spending money each month for the things you don't need? Do you have access to spending money each month for the things you don't need. And I should have said this at the beginning, but these responses are anonymous. No one's checking who said what. Give it just another second here. Okay, so 16 out of 17 people said yes, they have some money each month for things you don't need, and one respondent said no. The next question is, how much money would you be okay spending in a month on things you don't need? And you can choose from the options $10, $50, $100, or $500. And we'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, so 2 people said they'd be okay spending $10 a month on things they don't need. 3 people said $50, 5 people said 100, and 6 people said 500. So the next question is just asking you to rate the following, how much you agree or disagree with the following statements. How strongly do you agree with the following statements? People born with intellectual disabilities. And the first statement is can choose where they want to live. The second statement is choose how to spend their own money. The third statement is can make their own choices about sex. And the fourth statement is can make their own medical choices. Got a few more trickling in. We'll give it just another second or two. Okay, and you can see the results there on the screen. Can choose where they want to live. Average score of 4.1. Can choose how to spend their own money. Average score of 3.9. Can make their own choices about sex. An average score of 3.9. And can make their own medical choices, an average score of 3.8. I believe this is a 5-point scale, I'm guessing just by the graphic. Okay, next question is similar, but it says, how strongly do you agree with the following statement? People who acquire cognitive impairments later in life, people who acquire cognitive impairments later in life can choose where they want to live, can choose how to spend their own money, can make their own choices about sex, and can make their own medical decisions. Okay, so the first one can choose where they want to live. You had an average score of 4.5. 4.4, excuse me. Can choose how to spend their own money, 4.0. Can make their own choices about sex, 4.2. Can make their own medical decisions, for 3.9. And the average score of all of those was 4.1. I just want to go back one slide to compare. The average score there was a little bit lower. The average score there was 3.9 for people born with intellectual disabilities versus 4.1 for people who acquire cognitive impairments later in life. A few more questions. Actually, let's pause there. And I want to go through that first series of questions and ask, anybody surprised in their responses? Did this make you think about things in a different way you have before, or surprised by how you had to respond to these questions? And there's a little, on the bottom of the screen here, there's a little chat feature. You can click in there if you want people to see your chats. You could also chat in the Teams chat. And I don't know, Kona, if people they're all muted online. Okay. So anybody in the room to start, and Kona, let me know if we get some responses online. Let's make you think about things in a different way. Anything surprise you about these responses?
People have help, what people with disabilities are going through and everything until they walk in their own shoes.
Yeah, so Brian said, just for the folks online, if you couldn't hear, that folks who don't experience disabilities might not understand what a person with a disability experiences on a daily, and until they've experienced that for themselves. Victoria, I think you had something.
What to do, and it's like, I don't know, it made me think more about like just how much freedom I have generally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Victoria said made her think about how much freedom she has generally, that a lot of people, we don't think about that. Other thoughts? Okay. Did we get any responses online? Okay. I know for myself, when I have this conversation, that is definitely one of the things that I think about. And the way that this often comes up for me in my practice, and I didn't introduce myself, I know folks in the room know me, but for folks online, my name's Tal Golden. I'm an attorney here and the director of advocacy. And what I just took you through, those questions, what we really did is we took you through what's called a supported decision-making plan. And it starts with this presumption that each of us needs help making decisions every single day. Doesn't matter what your abilities are, right? I can fix a lot of things, but I don't know a darn thing about how an internal combustion engine works. So I go see a mechanic. I'm a lawyer, but you don't want me doing my own tax returns. So I have an accountant for that, right? I'm a civil rights lawyer. I'm not a tax lawyer. If I had a tax problem, I go see a tax lawyer. When I have a medical need, there are some things that I know a little bit about, and there's some things I go see my general practitioner, and there's some things I want to talk to a specialist about. So all of us make decisions every day and need help making decisions. And sometimes it's things like, how do I have this difficult conversation, right? That maybe is not something that I'm that good at. My wife's a social worker. Sometimes I'll ask her that question, and she'll say, don't say it that way, unless you really want to make somebody angry. Try this one. We all need help making decisions. And one of the ways I think this plays out when I talk to people, it often comes up when I'm talking to parents of people with disabilities. And they are asking me, I have this child, they have a disability, often they have autism or an intellectual disability, and they're worried about their kiddo. What's going to happen when they turn 18 and they have the power to make all these decisions for themselves as an adult? And I really have to work on people sometimes to get them to understand and think about all of the decisions that we make and what is the level of risk involved in each of those decisions. So, and I'll get to that question online in just a minute. So I chose to put on a green jacket today instead of a brown jacket, right? I chose, instead of doing the cardio, I ran up the hill instead with my dog because I just wasn't feeling it today. Right? And those are low risk decisions, but they're the decisions that give us what's called the dignity of risk. It makes life meaningful. The ability to make those choices for ourselves, that adds richness to life. And the sky's not falling because somebody can make those decisions. And when you start to explore those with people, you start to, I think, open up some ideas about where can we give people some decision-making authority and what other tools can we use to help them make decisions while still controlling for some things that we are worried about. That maybe this person isn't really good at managing a checkbook, but is there a zone of comfort that we have to say, well, there is amount of money that we could spend that you could just blow at the casino, right? We had a lot of people who said they'd be comfortable spending $500 a month on things that they don't need. That's a lot. There's a lot of freedom in $500 a month. Conan, what was a question that came up or the comment that came up online?
Yeah, there's a comment that says it was surprising to see the difference between the average scores between those born with intellectual disabilities and those who acquire them. It almost reminds me of the nature versus nurture discussion.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. The comment online was, it was interesting to see the difference between people born with intellectual disabilities and those who acquired cognitive impairments later in life. And it was almost the nature versus nurture discussion. I thought that was interesting too. Anybody online or in the room have any thoughts about why that turned out a little bit different?
The first one, because you use the word born, I think in our brains, we automatically assume people are maybe a little bit younger. I think it's subconscious.
Okay.
And then the second question,
Oh,
which is
interesting.
later in life, I think subconsciously we're thinking elderly.
Okay, that's interesting. So the commenter said that the first question, when I used the word born, may get people thinking about younger people. And the second question may have gotten people thinking about, when we say acquired later in life, that we might be thinking about elderly folks, maybe elderly folks with dementia or other cognitive impairments. Are there any other comments or questions online?
Yeah, someone says early intervention can make a difference.
Early intervention can make a difference. Yeah, absolutely. The thing that made me think about in DC, I'm going to get the name of this wrong, but in DC, they have a program in the schools. It's called something to the effect of like collective decision making in play. That's totally the wrong name of it. That's the concept. And what they're doing in schools is teaching kids how to make decisions together about what they want to play. And it made me think about that because that is a choice that we make as a society, as parents, as educators, is what are we teaching people from the very beginning about the decisions that they can make and they can't make, and what kind of personal autonomy they have and they don't have. And those are society, those are decisions that we make for people with disabilities all the time as a society. We are making decisions in the law. We're making decisions in the way that we deliver services. We make the decisions about which doors are open and which doors aren't based on societal impressions about risk, about the dignity of risk and whether we're going to allow that to people and how much of that we're going to allow. So any other thoughts from that first question, from that first set of questions? Anything else that made folks think about? Kristen? Yeah.
Let me retract my,
Oh,
I hate microphones. The first
question, the average was lower, and then the second question, the average was higher. Is that right?
The average was, we can go back. So let me make sure. So the question, people who acquire cognitive impairments, was an average of 4.1. And then born with, yes, born with was lower,
So kind of
3.9.
parallel to her comment about people born with intellectual disabilities. And I'm not saying this is what I think, but they haven't been given the opportunity to make choices, whereas when it something acquired later in life, those people have potentially already made decisions. So just thinking about the difference of the average.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, let me paraphrase, make sure I'm understanding what you're saying, is that with people who are born with intellectual disabilities, we don't give them as many choices to make. We take that decision-making authority away from them early in life. And that is true. You know, one of the things that you'll see, you know, we think about a lot in the disability community and disability rights community, is that we start to teach exclusion very, very early in life. My daughter has autism, and we didn't know that she had autism when she was 2 or 3. She seemed like a, you know, typically developing kid who had some big tantrums sometimes. But when you're 2 or 3 and you have tantrums, that's within sort of the normal range of human experience and in human development. So nobody's thinking about it until you get a little bit older and you're not where your peers are in terms of that emotional regulation. But what started to happen to her in preschool, like before public school, in preschool, you know, paid preschool programs, when she started to have these big behaviors, they started to exclude her. At one point, she was in the laundry room in the preschool, and we had some words about that with the preschool people, right? But very early in life, we're teaching, you're different, go stand over there, right? Go do this thing. You can't make this choice for yourself. And the skill acquisition, right? It takes practice in life to get good at making decisions. So what are we doing when we start to remove those decision-making opportunities early in life? Is we're giving people less chance to exercise that muscle. Going on.
Yeah, and there's another comment. It came in a few minutes ago, but I think it's still applicable. It says learned helplessness or dependence.
So the comment said, yeah, learned helplessness or dependence, and that's certainly, you know, a way that that idea has been formulated. You know, something I would see maybe in a different way. My older sister was born with cerebral palsy, and has been dependent because she's always used a wheelchair. So she's always been dependent on somebody else to help her meet some of her basic daily needs. And I think one of the things that I see from her in how that plays out is she feels like she's always asking somebody to do her a favor. And she pulls back on what she's willing to ask for because she doesn't want to impose on people. Right. And it's basic needs. I want to eat this. I don't want to eat that. Well, the person who helps her thinks it's easier to cook X and not Y. And so that choice is eliminated. And there's a million little choices like that that make the difference in terms of how much autonomy we have in our own lives.
You know, you hear something and you put it in a box, and a lot of those things don't fit in that box that they're being put in, because things that are being categorized don't always fit exactly in that category.
That's right. And you know, our systems are built around putting people in boxes. Our service delivery systems, or Medicaid and our Social Security and our school systems, are you fit in this box because you check this set of legal requirements, and you don't fit in this box. And if you fit in this box, you get A, B, and C. And if you fit in this box, you get D, E, and F, or you don't get anything. All right. Any other thoughts or questions or comments before we move on? So the next series of questions is a little bit about understanding what a guardianship is. Skip forward. Okay, so I'll put this up. I think some people already responded, but if you didn't, how strongly do you agree with the following statements? Guardianships make things easier for the person under guardianship. Guardianships make things easier for the guardian. Guardianships make things easier for both the person under guardianship and the guardian. Guardianships do not make things easier for either the person under guardianship and the guardian. Let me read that again because I think I've got a typo in there. Guardianships do not make things easier for either the person under guardianship. That should say or the guardian. Guardianships do not make things easier for either the person under guardianship or the guardian. Okay, so it looks like we've got most of the responses in. So does anybody want to share why they answered that last one the way they did? Why folks think that guardianships do not make things easier for either the person under guardianship or the guardian?
Depends upon variables of the situation, depends on the simplicity of the guardianship. And it depends upon the simplicity or the complexity of the guardian, you know, whether they're good at.
I'm just putting this.
That's fine.
Whether they're good, whether the guardian is good at what they're doing and
Yeah,
the
yeah, and they're
complexities involved.
compassionate or not compassionate or open or closed. I mean, it depends upon the variables of the situation as to whether the match is.
Yeah, okay. Are there any other thoughts or comments on that question? Anybody who had, want to talk about any of the other responses? Go ahead.
Yeah, online, we have a comment. In my experience, guardianships have been used for control and not to help or protect the person under the guardianship.
Okay. Everybody hear that in the room? Anybody want me to repeat that? Okay.
That can be abused.
They can, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute here. Okay, so if my family member or my friend or my child, if they're not under a guardianship, I'm worried that. So let me read that again. If my friend, child, or family member is not under a guardianship, I'm worried that. So some of the responses here is, I'm worried that the person will be taken advantage of. I'm worried that nobody will be able to make a big decision. Nobody will be able to make a big decision. They won't be able to enroll in school. They won't understand and no one will be there to help. They will be taken advantage of or have their future life ruined, have their life ruined. They'll be taken advantage of. They won't have supports to help them make decisions. Something might happen medically that they can't navigate on their own. Losing access to housing, medical support, basic needs. They might be vulnerable for neglect or abuse. What would help you address these concerns? What are some things that would help you address these concerns? So some of the responses here, what would help you address your concerns are knowing the person will have help, a plan before the person becomes incapacitated, access to a case manager or similar professional, supported decision-making plan and powers of attorney, responsiveness from the guardian, decision-making support tools, education on all aspects or of benefits and pros cons of guardianships, being with them more often, a community support network, a plan they understand set in place, more understanding and acceptance in the world, and knowing there are other supports. Anybody have any thoughts? I want to talk about these because I want to use this slide to sort of explore some of the alternative options that are out there. So anybody have any thoughts or comments before I get into it a little bit? Victoria, go ahead.
This is coming from someone who just doesn't know very much about like guardianships and like other forms of support for people. Like, I don't think there's a lot of information for people out there on what supported decision making even existing, or like other support systems in the first place. That's like something you have to look for when you need it. It's not like something built in the community that people can just see all the time.
That's right. These options, these alternative options, aren't well known. And lots of people have heard about a guardianship and have some understanding to some extent that it is a court order that takes a decision-making authority from one person to some extent and puts it in another person. People have, I think, generally some basic understanding of what that is. Although they may not understand the details and the nuances. But a lot of people don't know what a supported decision-making plan or what other alternatives are out there. So I want to start with supported decision-making and what that is. And really at the beginning of this presentation, I took you through that, which starts with that question, starts with what I was talking about earlier, the presumption that everybody makes decisions all day long and people need help. And it starts with then sitting down with the person and asking the same questions that I did. What are the decisions that you're comfortable making for yourself? And what decisions would you need help with? And I've done this with many people with varying levels of disability, and they're able to respond in different ways in their own capacity, right? Some people, I've had this conversation with people who are nonverbal, and it takes a little bit more time because they're using an assistive communication device. Or I may have to give them sort of an A/B test. I have to say this one or this one because it's easier for them to interact in that way. But usually they can tell me A or B, or sometimes a lot more detail. So what are the decisions you need help with? Who helps you make those decisions, or who would you want to help you make those decisions? And again, people are pretty used to telling me this. My case manager, I've known them for years. They've been helping me. My mom, my primary physician who's taken care of me forever, right? Or for as long as I can remember. My aunt, my neighbor. And then you start to say, well, what decisions match them up for me? What decisions would you want help from certain people? Oh, well, I'll ask my mom about financial stuff. She's really good at that. And my aunt is really good at, like, she's a nurse. She can help me with medical stuff. And you can start to get into some details. Well, tell me a little bit more about medical. Like, what decisions could you make for yourself? And, true story, like, client of mine says, oh, well, I need a shot. That's fine. I can do that by myself. If I need surgery, these are the people that I want to help me make that decision. How would you want to communicate with them? We asked that question. And you saw that most people said, oh, it's just a face-to-face conversation or text message. Okay, so text message, so-and-so, and I need some help. Can we meet or can we chat? Sure. So we'll have that first part of that conversation where they identify the needs and the supports and who they might want to support. And then to the extent that those people sort of aren't already in the circle, as a facilitator, I'll bring them in and I'll help them. I say, Cole, can I have a release? Can I call your doctor? And I'll call the doctor, or we'll call them doctor together and say, hey, can you sit down and have a meeting with us? and we'll bring all these people together. We'll bring in, say, the financial helper, we'll bring in the medical helper, we'll bring in the day-to-day, what I want to eat helper. And we sit down, we literally have a meeting. It's kind of a facilitated meeting. And we all have this conversation. Yeah, I'm happy to help with that. I'm happy to help with this. I'm happy to help with that. Here's how you should reach me, right? I work well with email. Doctor might say, you got to call my nurse, and then we'll set up an appointment if it's emergent. And then we write that down. And that's what a supported decision-making plan is. It's just a plan of action. It's just if I need this, I call this person. In the state of Montana, they're not legally binding. The plan itself is not legally binding. It's just a decision-making tool. It's a planning tool. In other states, a supported decision-making plan is legally binding. It's like a power of attorney, where you're saying this person can help and has the legal authority to help make a decision with me. But in Montana, then the next step might be some of these things need a power of attorney, for example. If I need help making a decision about serious medical condition and I'm incapacitated, I want my mom to make those decisions for me. My mom has to have a power of attorney, and we go out and do a form power of attorney for that, for medical. I don't need my mom to make my decisions about my $500 a month that I can spend on expendable stuff. I don't need a power of attorney for that. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But there's also other tools that are low, sort of low overhead. So let's say, you've got a person, they have their primary source of income is Social Security Disability, SSI, say. And they're going to get their, 800, Eva, you can help me out. It's 800 and some odd dollars a month, right? And that 800 and some odd dollars a month is gonna cover their food and their shelter and some of their essentials, and they have maybe $50 a month in expendable income. They're going to have a representative payee, right? There's a Social Security rule. I'm sorry, it's so hot in here, guys. I don't know what's going on with our heat, but they are going to have a representative payee. Social Security rules allow that a person who can't make their own financial decisions can establish a payee who will receive their money and pays out their expenses. So the vast majority of their expenses, their money spent each month is going to be carried by the payee. And they're going to have $50 a month maybe of stuff that, it really doesn't matter. Like if they want to go to the casino and blow it, they can still pay their rent. They'll still have food on the table. That stuff's taken care of. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is with controlling a bank account. So you can have a bank account that's set up with two signatures. You can have a bank account that's set up with what's called eyes only, where another person can see the transactions but can't make any transactions. So the person, say, and you can work that in multiple different ways, but let's say the person with a disability can see what's coming in and out of their account, but only has a certain amount of spending authority. A bank can set that up. So there's a lot of different tools that are out there. Any other tools that folks have used or can think about that might be a different way to address these needs? Go ahead. Yeah.
And that is, can supported decision-making plans only be completed with an attorney?
No.
And you kind of touched on that a little bit, but yeah, if you could clarify that. When does an attorney enter the picture? And before that happens, what does it look like if a non-attorney is trying to complete this?
Right. And so you don't need an attorney to set up a supported decision-making plan. At the end of this presentation, or the link that you use, the QR code that you use to get into this presentation, but there's a QR code at the end and it's on our website. There's a bunch of materials and links online for resources about supported decision-making. And one of them is the supported decision-making form. And a person could could fill that out, and you can fill that out today and you could change it tomorrow. Right? There's no legal formality to it. It doesn't have to be notarized. You can if you really want to, but it doesn't really mean anything to notarize it. And you don't need an attorney to make that plan. The question in my mind would be, what are the support structure look like? And do you need an attorney? And so if you're a person, for example, that lives in a group home and has a cost plan for their Medicaid waiver, money's coming in, that money's getting paid through to a case manager. The case manager and or the rep payee is paying out expenses. And what you get is your $50 in cash, say that's expendable. Then there isn't a whole lot that necessarily needs a legal formality. You may want a medical power of attorney there. You may want some estate planning documents like an advance directive, what happens if you're incapacitated and you need life-sustaining treatment. Those are just good estate planning tools that everybody should have. So that at that point, you may want to bring in an attorney to help with that part of it. But you don't necessarily need an attorney at the planning phase to say, let's identify, almost in sort of a project management approach of let's identify the things that I need help and who would help with that and where there's support. So you don't need an attorney at that point. It's sometimes helpful to have a facilitator, but that facilitator could be a case manager. That facilitator could be a family member. We've done those on occasion. We'll facilitate those conversations. So those are kind of the options. And it is sort of becomes the legal requirement comes into play depending on what the authority that needs to be exercised is. So if you need somebody to make a medical decision for you when you're incapacitated, yes, you should have a power of attorney for that. If you're going to need somebody to access your bank account in a way that hasn't been set up through the bank, you may need a financial power of attorney for part of that. Other questions or comments online? Okay. Yeah.
Be written in a manner that's just as restrictive as a guardianship?
I mean, it could be. It could be written in a restrictive manner, but the key difference is it's consensual. It's the person making their own decisions, and the person can tear it up tomorrow or right there and then. So if the person is saying, I want this level of restriction, I don't have a problem with that. That's a person exercising their right of self-determination and saying, these are the choices I want to make, and I want to have only this limit. I don't trust myself for some reason, or, I know that when my mental health fluctuates, I don't want to be able to make these decisions when I'm not doing well. So I'm going to limit the universe. But if you're making those decisions for yourself, that's a choice. And that's something that we're a lot more comfortable with, somebody saying, I know myself, and this is the universe that I want to live in. Versus a guardianship, which is different from a power of attorney, right? Because a guardianship, a judge is saying, this is the decisions you can and can't make. And if that needs to change, you've got to go back to the judge, and the judge has to change their decision. And sometimes that happens, and sometimes that can be really hard. Now, a power of attorney is a little different, right? A power of attorney typically is saying this person shares my authority. My wife has my power of attorney. If I get hit by a bus tomorrow, she can access my bank accounts. She could access my bank accounts today. If she really wanted to, she can take my power of attorney and go into the bank. And, if they're savvy, they may say, wait a minute, can you prove to me that he's not around? But legally, like, she's sharing that authority. So when I draft a power of attorney for somebody, for a client, I'm going to say, okay, make sure it's somebody that you trust. Don't just give your power of attorney to somebody who can then walk down to the bank and take all your money. But they're not taking their decision-making away, and they can change the power. I can change my power of attorney tomorrow, right? I don't need to go to court and ask a judge to change that. So flexible tools.
You said that there was a link for a form for the power. Do you know if they also have some examples of some that have already been filled out, so somebody can just,
I don't know if they have examples. They probably do. There's two sites. One is supporteddecisionmaking.org, and I think the other one's called supporteddecisions.org. And they've got tons of information on there. I'm not sure if they have samples. They probably do. And then there are statutory what are called a short form power of attorney I think they're still on the Montana Department of Justice website. That if somebody needed a simple power of attorney, you could fill out that form. The legislature created that process to make it easy for people to do powers of attorney. And so there is a form online for that. Now, if you have, especially if it's more complicated, if there are more nuanced decisions and you want to really get granular about like these are the healthcare decisions I want made or don't want made, or if you've got some assets, if you've got some money and you own some property, then that's when you certainly want to see an attorney. You don't want to just fill out that short form power of attorney where there's more complexity because there's tax implications, there's other things you need to be thinking about. All right, so I'm going to move forward a little bit here. Go ahead.
Along those lines, really quick, what is the cost? What does it cost? Is there a free version of this? Is there a costly version of these things that you're talking
Yeah,
about?
so
What's
that's
the
a good
price
question, and
tag
that's one of
on
that is one of the considerations. So it costs theoretically nothing to do a supported decision-making plan. You go look at our form, you write it down, you bring your people together, you write it down. If you use a power of attorney, and Cohen, I'll say this, and maybe you can remind me or somebody can remind me. The Montana State Extension Office has a really good document. They do these things called Mont Guides, and they have a document about powers of attorney that's really useful, sort of plain English explanation. So it doesn't necessarily cost anything to do a power of attorney, but if you have to get an attorney involved and it's more complicated, then obviously the attorney's going to charge you. Typically, they're going to charge per hour. Now, guardianships depend. Sometimes a guardianship action is brought by a county attorney, and so they're not charging for that. Sometimes people spend a lot of money on guardianships. You'll have family members fighting over a guardianship, and when everybody's represented by private counsel, that can cost money. Sometimes there's a cost to having guardianship in that there has to be an accounting to the court, and somebody has to prepare that. So if there's a private attorney paying for that, you're paying for that every year usually, and that's what's supposed to be every year. And then obviously if things have to go and get changed, and you use a private attorney, then you've got to go and pay that attorney to go back and change things. I don't know, Judge, if you have anything you wanted to add there from the perspective of a judge. I know there's a lot. No.
I mean, I think that's accurate. I'd say the accountings
Mhm.
vary widely in sophistication. It depends a lot on.
Yeah.
Assets. Sometimes it's very minimal. If someone sends bank accounts for their checking account for 12 months, and that's my campaign. Sometimes it's, he's a professional and it's very expensive. So it varies a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that is really important for, for the folks out there online, is it really, when you come into the financial part of it, it is really thinking about what that person has, what that person who would be under guardianship or under a supporter, using a supported decision making, what kind of assets they have and what kind of assets they might inherit. So a lot of people, out there that we talk to sometimes, they're parents who have some resources, they've got some money, they've got some property, and they have a kid with a disability. And when they pass away, that kid's going to inherit some stuff. That's a situation where you want to go see a private attorney, right? You may need to set up a special needs trust. There's tax implications there. So the more money the person might either have or get from family members, the more it makes more sense to go see a private attorney about that. So here, the next question was, which of the following choices can people under full guardianships legally make? Where they live, what they want to eat, drink, what happens to their body, who they have an intimate relationship with, how to spend the money, their money and if they want to get married. And the actual answer to that is if you have the broadest guardianship, then generally the answer to all those questions is none of them. You can't decide where you're going to live. A guardian can decide that for you if you have a full guardianship. You may be able to decide what you eat or drink, but if you're in care and somebody says, nope, you can't have that, you're not going to get that. We have had cases where people have had food locked away from them in the place where they live. What happens to their body, both in terms of medical care. So, an example a real example is somebody who is in a long-term marriage, and then they're under guardianship, and then the guardian decides you can't have an intimate relationship with your husband or wife anymore. How to spend their money. So that is generally a big part of a guardianship. In Montana, they can be divided. You can have just a conservatorship, which is just about money. You can have a guardianship, and typically guardianship means both money and control of the person. And if they want to get married, and we've had that case too. We've had cases where a person wanted to get married or was married, and the guardian went and tried to get the marriage annulled or tried to stop them, get a court order to stop them from getting married. You don't have the legal capacity to consent to marriage if you're under full guardianship. No, that would be a very restrictive guardianship. I don't understand.
Like if you have the least restrictive kind, wouldn't make any of those.
If I said that, I said that wrong. This would be one of the most restrictive guardianships. This would be like a full guardianship without any limitations. And what I'll say with that is we hope this is changing. One of the things that we are really trying to do is educate the judiciary and educate lawyers about being a lot more nuanced in their viewpoint of guardianships. And we certainly had for a long period of time, and I still think there's lots of them out there, where there wasn't a lot of challenge, right? So guardianships were being just granted whole cloth, a full guardianship. And I'll go out on a limb here, Judge, and you please correct me, but the way that the court system works is if there isn't a dispute, then nobody's raising a question to a judge, right? So when sometimes you have a parent that comes in and asks for their child to be put under guardianship, and sometimes the public defender is appointed, and sometimes we see that they aren't. And so sometimes there's nobody on the other side of that case saying, wait a minute, slow down. Let's be more nuanced about this. And if there's nobody disputing it, then there tends to be, like in any case, that the side who came forward gets what they asked for. Now, judges should be making an independent evaluation. But I think that depends on the judge and their viewpoints and how much time they have, and judges are busy. So we certainly saw this long era of very, very broad guardianships being entered. And now we're starting to see it move a little bit. And we're starting to see some of those come back. We're starting to see people who were put under guardianship 20 years ago that were getting calls from case managers saying, whoa, what's up with this? This person's been living independently for years. They live in a group home, they make their own decisions every day. And like, they don't even see their guardian. Like their guardian comes down once a year, and why are they still in guardianship? So we occasionally take those cases and we'll challenge them and say, look, it may have been appropriate 20 years ago. Sometimes we'll look at them and say they probably weren't appropriate in the first place. But look at the situation now. This is a person who can hold down a job. This is a person who's making decisions every day. They are consenting to their own healthcare. And we see that too. Like we see sometimes the doctors don't even know, like this person's signing off on their own healthcare every day and no one blinked an eye to say, wait a minute, do you have a legal capacity to sign off on your own healthcare? Nobody knew. So, then we go back to the judge and say, wait a minute. I don't know, Judge, if you have anything you want to add there.
Well, you said, I think, I agree 100%. The biggest issue is that our job is to decide, it's not to go looking for.
That's
them.
right.
And so everyone comes in and the only information I have is everyone agreeing this is appropriate. It's not appropriate for me actually to go out and say, let's find some more facts.
Right.
And there's often a problem, there's not very good diversity. In other words, there's not people on both sides of it. And you sometimes appoint the public defender. We also be sensitive to their resources, and some public defenders are very knowledgeable. When guardianships are good, some of them, it's really an afterthought. I don't think they do a very thorough vetting, especially when you have issues like a non-verbal example. I don't know how much they're actually doing to like independently assess what's in their best interests.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And it is something that we're reaching out. I just reached out to the Judges Association to hopefully do a training with them in October. And we're currently working with the public defenders to try to do some more education statewide around that. And they want the help. I think they're not out there saying they think they know everything. I think they're being humble about it and saying they want the help and they don't have adequate resources too. But I think that's exactly right. Is the judge, it's not their job to go out and build the case. It's the people that are litigating in front of them. So part of the, I think, approach that we're taking is educating the public and saying, let's make sure we're being thoughtful about this before it becomes an issue in front of a court and a judge has to make a decision. Because it's also not an option for the judge to say, I'm not going to decide this case. And so somebody's got to make a decision, but can we come before that and cut it off before? And that's a good segue, I think, to get into this next section. Oh, go ahead.
And the question is, how would someone who has a guardian but has regained capacity in many areas become their own guardian again? Could supported decision-making be a legal alternative? So a lot of questions, maybe specifically.
Let me repeat. No, it's a great question. So let me repeat, make sure I understand. So the question is, how does a person who is under a guardianship restore their rights, become their own guardian, and could a supported decision-making plan help with that?
And a key part in there is they were under guardianship, they've regained a lot of capacity in many areas. And then, how do you move toward?
So the answer to that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here, is you have to prove to a judge that you now have capacity, that you don't meet the legal definition of incapacity anymore. And we'll talk about what that definition means in a second. And that is a really, really important point because that's very hard to do. It's very hard, when you think about a judge that sometimes it's the same judge. They decided at one point you didn't have capacity. Now you got to change their mind. You're going to have to come forward with evidence that says you do have capacity. And that evidence looks like it can't be the person just themselves saying these are all the decisions I make by myself. That's helpful, but it's not enough. You're usually going to have an expert witness. You're almost certainly going to have an expert witness, and that's going to have to be under the statute, under the law, a medical professional, a psychiatrist, psychologist, that says, I've examined this person and they don't meet the legal definition of incapacity anymore. And that's not easy to do. Now, would it be helpful in that process to say, I've come forward with a support decision-making plan? If I was presenting that case to a judge, I would bring that evidence, absolutely. I would say, Judge, here's their support decision-making plan. And then I bring in all these witnesses who are their supporters to help the judge understand that there are these other people who are going to help them. I think, and again, I'm here in front of a judge, but so from my perspective, I wonder if that helps the judge feel a little more comfortable. If you're sort of on the fence about the evidence of capacity, but you're presented with good evidence of they have supports in place, that you're not signing off as a judge on somebody who you're going to be seeing them again in your courtroom in a couple weeks or a couple months, and something bad happened, I'm wondering if that makes it feel, if that makes it an easier decision. If that helps. You don't have to answer that question. I'm just pontificating, but I certainly, if it was my case and I was if I was moving for restoration of rights, I would bring that evidence in. And I think the more important point is that's not an easy case. Some of the barriers that you could come across in that case are also changing hearts and minds in the medical profession. We have psychiatrists who will still say, like, I don't know why anybody wouldn't want to be under guardianship. That's great. They're fully protected. It's not that easy. You got to go out and find a psychiatrist who's a little bit more, modern in their thinking, who understands the ideas of autonomy and the dignity of risk, and who's willing to really in and say this person has capacity or doesn't have capacity, or and again, this isn't sort of the first resort, but it might be a last resort, is could we limit the guardianship? Could we come away from this very, very broad guardianship where all those decisions here are taken away and say, there's a zone where, as a judge, I'm comfortable and you've shown me adequate evidence that the person can make competent decisions in these areas. And then there's this zone, and that may often be about money, where, the person, you haven't shown evidence that they can make those responsible decisions. So what I'm going to do is do a limited guardianship. I'd rather see that than a full guardianship. I'd rather see nothing as a disability rights advocate, but I'd rather see a limited guardianship where they have a lot of decisions that they can make, and some places where they have somebody else helping with the decision making, than a full broad guardianship. So I want to skip forward on some of these questions, just looking at the time, and get a little bit more into some of the details. And I will stop at that one because I think that's really important. I didn't capture it anywhere else. A person under guardianship cannot vote. True or false? Okay, so 4 people said true, 8 people said false. A person under guardianship cannot vote. So most people got that right. A person under guardianship can vote unless there's a court order that says they cannot vote. And usually, in my experience, that isn't limited by courts won't specifically say the person cannot vote. And there's good reason for that, because why are we policing people's vote? Right? People make some wacky electoral decisions all the time, and we don't challenge how they make their decisions. People vote for people because they wore the red tie or the blue tie, and nobody asks. So why would a judge say, oh, here's a person with a disability, I'm going to micromanage their vote? So usually we don't see that. Usually people under guardianship can vote. So a little bit about the law. In Montana, guardianship requires a judicial determination that the person is incapacitated, and that judicial intervention, the court has to get involved in the person's personal freedom of action and decision, and that's necessary to meet essential requirements for the person's physical health or safety. And that highlighted part is really important. Necessary to meet essential requirements for the person's physical health or safety. That's not good enough to say, oh, this would be a little bit more convenient, like they'd be a little bit less risky. Essential requirements for the person's physical health or safety. And Montana recognizes the significance of this rights deprivation, requires the court to make a finding that the identified needs of the person cannot be met in a less restrictive alternative. And that's new. As of 2021, the legislature added that language, requiring the court to actually make a finding that the identified needs cannot be met by a less restrictive alternative. And those less restrictive alternatives are some of those things that we talked about today. We probably have a long way to go there in terms of getting that fully embraced by the folks that are on both sides of guardianships and by judges. How much are we doing around and how much evidence are we presenting for the court around the availability of less restrictive alternatives? That's something I think we have some growth to do. But it's a new law, so we got to give it some time. So this is a definition of incapacitated person, and this is important because it goes to that question earlier of how do I get out from under guardianship? You can't meet this definition. You have to say you don't meet this definition. An incapacitated person means any person who is impaired by reason of mental illness, mental deficiency, physical illness or disability, chronic use of drugs, chronic intoxication, or other cause, except minority. You can't put somebody in a guardianship just because they're a child under this law. To the extent that the person lacks sufficient understanding or capacity to make or communicate responsible decisions concerning the person, or which cause has so impaired the person's judgment that the person is incapable of realizing and making a rational decision with respect to the person's need for treatment. So there's a lot in that, right? That's a really difficult standard. They lack sufficient understanding or capacity to make or communicate responsible decisions. So who decides what is a responsible decision, right? There's a quality judgment in that determination. And that's complicated. I also want to highlight the word communicate, because that's really important. I think we hear about that a lot, where people will tend to presume if a person is nonverbal, it doesn't communicate with words, in spoken words, that they lack capacity. But that's not necessarily true. There are lots of folks out there. I know some folks who are incredibly intelligent. They have no cognitive impairment whatsoever. They just can't speak. They use an assistive communication type device to communicate. Or they use ASL, right? That doesn't mean you can't make responsible decisions. It means you communicate in a different way. So we do have to be nuanced about thinking about, does the person have sufficient understanding or capacity to make or communicate responsible decisions? Yes, they can. Do they communicate it in the way that everybody else does? No, they don't. But can they communicate it? Yes. And of course, if we're presenting that case to a judge, we've got to put on evidence saying that. How does this person communicate? Guardianships for an incapacitated person may be used only as is necessary to promote and protect the well-being of the person. And the guardianship, and this is another place where I think we could use some work. The guardianship must be designed to encourage the development of maximum self-reliance and independence in the person, and may be ordered only to the extent that the person's actual mental or physical limitations require it. So baked in there is the idea of the guardianship should be as limited as possible, right? That's going to meet these needs, but be the least restrictive. So this goes to the voting and some other issues. An incapacitated person for whom a guardian has been appointed is not presumed to be incompetent and retains all legal and civil rights except those that have been expressly limited by court order. Expressly limited means the court said it, right, in hopefully in writing. By court order have been specifically granted to the guardian by the court. And so that's how we know that you've retained your right to vote, unless the court wrote down you can't vote, because by statute you retain those rights. And an incapacitated person may not be limited in the exercise of any civil or political rights, except those that are clearly inconsistent with the exercise of the powers granted to the guardian, unless the court order specifically provides for those limitations. So we're not going to presume it, right? We have to look and say, what did the judge actually say? And is that limitation inconsistent with the exercise of the powers granted to the guardian? The order should say that all rights not specifically limited are retained by the incapacitated person. Now, I want to point out one thing here because this is really important. Guardianship orders can change, and guardianship orders can also be temporary. And so if you are working with a person with a disability and you have a question about whether they are under guardianship and what the extent of that guardianship is, it's really important to make sure you have a current copy of the court's order. And sometimes that means you should go to the clerk of court and ask for a copy of that order. Because it is possible, and we've seen it before, where a guardianship expired, or some circumstances where it can expire by law, or it's been changed, or it's been made more restrictive, and the rights you think the person has, they don't have. And nobody updated that file. It's been sitting, with a case manager for 20 years, and they've had the same person in their care, and nobody went back because why would they think about it? That person's doing just fine. Then something comes up, like a medical issue, and the question comes, wait a minute, what's the scope of the guardianship? So really, really important, something that we do when we talk to a person in our practice, they're under guardian. The next thing that comes out of our mouth is, I need a copy of the guardianship order, current copy, because we want to know what we're dealing with. So less restrictive alternative is defined now by statute, an approach to meeting a person's need that restricts fewer rights of the person than would be the appointment of a guardian. The term includes supported decision-making, appropriate technological assistance. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about that, but that's often a really useful opportunity for somebody, is how can this be addressed through technology? And there's so much out there now, in terms of think about money management and how many apps there are to just help you do that. And appointment of a representative payee, which we talked about. And then there's a statutory definition now of supported decision-making, but it's pretty self-explanatory. It means assistance from one or more persons of a person's choosing in understanding the nature and consequences of a potential personal and financial decisions, which enables the person to make the decisions and communicating a decision once made if consistent with the person's wishes. And I think that, one of the big things that pops out there is the focus on the person whose rights are impacted, right? This really puts front and center if consistent with the person's wishes. It's the person expressing their own desires about how they want to make decisions. So this slide is a nice summary. This came out of North Carolina, but it's applicable everywhere. And it does do a nice job of highlighting those 5 options. These aren't the only options, but these are some of the common ways that a person can be supported in their decision making. So supported decision making, we've talked a lot about. An advance directive is a form that tells a physician what you want done to your body if you're incapacitated. Another thing that's not up here is called a pulsed order, a physician's order for life-sustaining treatment, which is similar to an advance directive, but it's entered by your physician and it goes into your medical file. So that's in terms of that question earlier about cost. That is a way that you can express those interests in a very low cost way. Is you go to your primary physician and you say, "Doctor, I want a pulsed order," and a good doctor is going to interview you about that and put an order in your medical file about what your decisions are. Do you want a feeding tube? Do you want them to use resuscitation, et cetera, et cetera? Makes me think about one other point I wanted to make in terms of a medical power of attorney. There is a registry which is maintained by the Montana Department of Justice, where if you have a power of attorney, you can register it with that registry. And the purpose of that registry is if you're in an emergency, if you were out driving an Ekalaka and you get hit by a car and you can't express your wishes, then hopefully the first responders are checking that registry so they know what your wishes are. So that's a good tool for people. And I will say, like, we don't have great we don't have perfect compliance there. There's still a lot of problems out there that we are addressing, that we've prioritized in terms of medical providers respecting pulsed orders and respecting powers of attorney and respecting advance directives. But it's certainly not a good idea to not have it out there and not register it. Representative payees we talked about. And then of course, there's the options of guardianships, and different degrees of guardianship. So the last thing, any questions before I move on from that slide?
And that's, if you could just, and the comment was, the problem with less restrictive alternatives is that they generally don't exist. And so I'm wondering, and then someone else in the chat did put some of the items that you had mentioned, but could you just list some of those alternatives to guardianship that are less restrictive? But I also wonder if you could, and also I'm gonna add my own question, which is like, what are the ways if you are limited in the people you know around you? Like if you're limited, you don't have family around you, or you don't have those close friends, what are the options and what are the ways that you see people, I guess, evolving this forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good, so first question is what are some of the options? And those are on this slide. They're not all the options, but again, if you go to supportdecisionmaking.org, there's a lot of other conversations on that website. You know, what do you do if you don't have those supports? It's complicated, and that's a complicated answer. On the one side of that answer is those are the people who tend to end up under guardianships, not because they necessarily need those more than other people, but because they don't have those natural supports. So that's something we have to work on as a community. But I would also say, how do we think outside the box on that? And what are the connection points? You know, it is true that some people with disabilities live very isolated lives. But probing that a little bit can be helpful. Do they have a relationship in church? You know, a pastor that they can rely on for some of this to help. Who else is out there in their life that may be willing to help? And I will say this, like, I've been surprised in having these conversations about how willing people have been to step up. I think for a lot of folks, it seemed like a super heavy responsibility. But when I've had these conversations, I've had caseworkers who essentially, like, this is their job, but they're willing to step up, which is outside of their job, in saying, yeah, this person, they don't live in my group home anymore. They've moved on to some other place, but I've known them since they were like 25 years old, and yeah, I'll do it. So sometimes it is people that were professionals that worked with them in the past. But it is hard, I think, you know, and I think the other thing I would say is, like, that's a good thing to call us about, you know, that's something that we as an advocacy organization could help start asking some of those questions and say, okay, well, who helps you? Who, like, we start to talk about the practicalities, and then people start to come out of the woodwork. Oh, actually, like, yeah, this person helps me every day. I just didn't think about them that way. So it can be hard, but you know, that's sort of what we're here for, is to try to explore some of that and see if we can problem solve for that.
And can I add
Yeah.
a little, and just, it's also a little plug for next week, but also I think applies to here. And next week, I'm the one that's going to be presenting, and one of the key components is what is called visionary fiction. And it is to help us realize existing power dynamics and then help us imagine paths to creating more just futures. And that does take a new way of thinking. That's not my concept. It is a concept from Waleida Imarisha. And but I think it applies here too. And how do we think about something going forward? Many things were fiction before they weren't.
That's right.
And so it does take creativity to
Yeah,
implement these things.
I think that's right. I mean, I think part of this is, as we start to think about and honor the idea of individual decision making and the idea of self-determination and how important that is to the human condition, then it does take a reimagining of how we relate to each other and how we support people with disabilities as a community. So that's a great point. So yeah, go ahead.
Like they're already asking to.
Yeah.
How do you resolve that if, supported decision making is about them finding supports in their lives? Like, how do you help someone or?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a series of like difficult conversations. But it also is part of what Conan is talking about, is starting to change our perceptions about disability and that it's not a burden, And I think, yeah, yeah. And I know, like, I'll tell you with my sister, like, I've had to really have a lot of conversations about that. I was saying, no, ask for what you need, and then my sister, she's 50 something now. Right. So she graduated high school, just as the 1990 amendments to IDEA, to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, were coming out. Most of her high school career, her elementary and high school career, was before. And the 1990 amendments were really like the big push, or before that. So she didn't grow up in an inclusive community. And 1990 was when the ADA came out. So when I was a kid and we'd go around, there were no curb cuts, right? And it was limiting. She didn't get to go a lot of places. So that's a part of her upbringing, and it's taken a lot. And I still have, frustrating conversations. There's like, no, you can ask for it. It's okay. And then as a parent, right? Like, that's a different conversation, different generation. So with our kids, what do? We teach them, self-advocacy, 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 right? My sister didn't grow up in that generation. But I think we're moving the ball there of saying, like, people, it's okay to ask for what you want, right? If you're neurodivergent, it's okay to say, like, this is too loud for me. I need to not be here right now, right? Can you close that window, right? Can you stop wearing perfume in the office? We're becoming more inclusive. We're getting better, but we still need to be having those conversations and increasing that level of saying it is okay to ask for what you need to get your way in the world. So I want to talk a little bit about school. I think this is really important. So what happens, and I'm not going to go through these questions because we're kind of running short on time, but I do want to talk about this for a minute. When a student with a disability who's on an IEP is an individualized education program. That's the plan for a student with a disability who's qualified under that federal law, IDEA. So it lays out where their deficits are and goals for how they're going to close those gaps and services they're going to get to close that gap. And when they turn 18 under the law, their rights to make decisions transfer to them because they're an adult. And folks get real nervous about this. School folks get really nervous about this. Like, the sky's going to fall when this kid consents to their own IEP, right? And they're just going to drop out and tell us all to go where we can go. So what schools do is they very frequently will tell a parent, you've got to put your kid under guardianship. Go run to court and get your kid under guardianship. And one, that's legal advice, and two, is very bad legal advice, right? And you can't be giving legal advice if you're not a lawyer. So under that law, under that federal law, there is a provision that says you don't have to put somebody under guardianship. All you have to do is sign a piece of paper that says, I'm giving my education decision-making authority to my mom, to my sister, to my pastor. You don't have to have a court determination that you're incapacitated. And that is where we've seen, these folks that I talked about earlier, where we're seeing them 20 years later now. That's what happened to a lot of people. A lot of people were put under guardianship at 18 years old, 20, 25, 30 years ago because of this problem. And they've never come out from under that guardianship because 25, 30 years ago, somebody said to a court, this person's incapacitated. Look at all these risky decisions. This person made a risky sexual decision. Well, how many 18-year-olds do you know that aren't under guardianships that made some pretty crappy decisions about sex, right? But I've known people that have been put under guardianship because of that, right? And then 20 years go by. But a lot of that happens here. And so we've done a lot of work with the schools trying to teach about this and say, you need to, there's a piece of paper, just a piece of paper. The problem is Montana never adopted a regulation for this. So there's a federal regulation and there's supposed to be a procedure implemented in state law, and Montana never did it. And 10 years ago, we brought a case to the Montana Supreme Court called In Re CS, and the court recognized that Montana never adopted a regulation, but the state hasn't caught up to that yet. So hopefully soon, we've got a new superintendent, and hopefully they'll finally fix that regulation to make it easy. In the materials that are attached or online, there is like the California form, and you'll see it's really like a 1-page document or a 2-page document that says, I hereby designate somebody as my educational decision maker. It has no other implications than that. It doesn't, it's not a general power of attorney. It's not a medical decision-making power of attorney. It's just for purposes of my IEP, so-and-so makes my decisions. And a lot of kids, you know, again, thinking about self-determination, thinking about self-advocacy, like that's not what we want. We want, as part of when you go to school, you learn how to live as an adult at some point at the end of this thing. That's kind of the goal, to say like, okay, you've made it through 11, 12 years of school. You should be able to make your own decisions about your own IEP. We should have prepped you for that this whole time. So we don't want people to have to designate an education decision maker, but some folks do. Some folks really have a cognitive level where they need some help. The key point there is don't run and go put them under guardianship. Let's look at what's the real issue here. Oh, they need help with this particular decision. Well, there's a document you can sign to help with this particular decision. So I'm going to skip these because I just talked about that. There's the site to INRI-CS. Montana never established these procedures. And no, you do not need to be under a guardianship to appoint an educational decision maker. And other states have this, with most other states have this with a regulation in a simple form. So last slide here, I think this is really important. This was from a discussion in Congress in 1987. And it says there is a powerful and unique abrogation of rights when a person's care is entrusted to another under a guardianship arrangement. The typical ward, that's the person under guardianship, we don't usually use that word anymore, has fewer rights than the typical convicted felon. They can no longer receive money or pay their bills. They cannot marry or divorce. By appointing a guardian, the court entrusts to someone else the power to choose where they will live, what medical treatment they will get, and in rare cases, when they will die. And I will say we've had that case too, where we've had to fight and say, go get an injunction to stop the guardian from literally killing this person. It is, in one short sentence, the most punitive civil penalty that can be levied against an American citizen, with the exception, of course, of the death penalty. And there is what the Montana Constitution says about the dignity of the human being. And the last quote is from the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is an international treaty that has been largely ratified, but not by the United States. And it says every person has a right to inherent dignity and individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own choices. So with that, I'll open the floor for any other questions or thoughts. And thank you all for your attention and time. Anything in the room or online?
Big thing is these things need to be made flexible enough that they work, and they need to have maximum participation from everybody involved.
That's
And
right.
there needs to be like at least an annual review of the process to make sure that all the I's are being dotted and the T's are being crossed and it's working.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, none of these documents that we talked about, well, actually, that's true of a guardianship too. Like none of this should just be shelved. There should be regular review and really careful analysis, but certainly if it's sort of outside of the purview of a court, where it's at least coming up occasionally for review, It is really important if you have a supported decision-making plan that team is meeting regularly and making sure that everybody's still on the team, that it's responsive to the needs, and that we don't need to make tweaks. Yeah, that's a great point.
Question online, when there is concern that someone is abusing their power as a guardian, what steps can the person under the guardianship take?
So that's a really good question. And some of the material online, there's more information about abuses in guardianship. There's a lot out there. The National Disability Rights Network has written a lot about abuses in guardianship. There's a lot of very troubling statistics about the abuse of people under guardianship. Couple things that can happen. Sometimes sometimes it's a law enforcement issue. B, sometimes it's a call to adult protective services is appropriate. And C, and these aren't necessarily in order, that's a call to our office too. Like part of our authority to investigate abuse and neglect is of investigating abuse and neglect and financial exploitation of people under guardianship. So that would be an appropriate referral to our office as well, in addition to other things. Now, if there's another, we are not a law enforcement agency. We can't go arrest people. So if there's already law enforcement involvement, we'll still take the call and we may look into it, but we may not take much action on it because there's a law enforcement agency that's already involved here. But it's still appropriate to call us on that. And then, one of the things that would also be very concerned about is if there's a pattern, like in a particular facility or with a particular guardian. Any other questions online or questions in the room? Yeah.
Conservatorship and a representative payee.
Oh.
Conservatorship is for finance.
Yeah, so in Montana, the law could split a guardianship and a conservatorship. A conservatorship is like a guardianship, but only for money. So there's a person who makes that decision for the person, but only about money. Whereas a guardianship typically has money and control over the person. And a rep payee is not a court process. A rep payee is you fill out a form with the Social Security Administration and appoint a person as a representative payee. And that only has to do with that Social Security money. They don't necessarily have control over other stuff that's not Social Security. Correct me if anything I missed there. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
So question online, the state hospital and other state mental health providers are suffering from a lack of consistent leadership and funding. I am being appointed to more and more guardianship cases to get individuals into community placements in the state hospital. How do I do this without infringing on the rights of the disabled clients?
I think I may have to take a pass on that one. That's a big question. Mike, I don't know. Do you have anything you want to put in there?
Not sure of the context or the basis of the question. We're in context of looking alternatives to commitment process. Not sure on it.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a very big question. What I would say there is, if this is a public defender or another attorney calling and wants to chat about a case specifically, like we will take that call typically, and we'll at least bat around some ideas with you.
And this is a question for me, just because someone may be listening to this after tonight. What is the relationship with our office if there is an attorney involved in a person with a guardianship already? How can we interact with them? How do we interact with the guardian and the person under guardianship?
That depends. on the attorney's position in the case. So, but our authority as a PNA allows us to talk to people with disabilities, even if they're under guardianship. And this it gets into legal ethics, but I think it's fair to call this a consensus opinion that a person under guardianship can consult with an attorney, even though they may not legally have the capacity to contract an attorney, because otherwise it would be impossible for them to challenge their own guardianship. So that is the position that we've taken, is that if a person under guardianship wants to call us, we will talk to that person. That doesn't necessarily mean there's anything we can do, or that we won't have to jump through some legal hurdles to do that. There have been cases in the past where we have had to go to a court and ask the court to appoint what's called a guardian ad litem, which is, for lack of a better term, sort of a guardian for a specific case, and then have that guardian ad litem retain us as an attorney for that person. So that sometimes you have to kind of jump through those legal hoops, but it really depends on the circumstance. Any other questions? Anything else?
One more comment that says, get them waiver supports that provides an extra layer of advocacy.
Say that again.
It says, get them waiver supports that can provide an extra layer of advocacy.
I think what that's talking about is Medicaid waiver. It can be very high. I mean, if somebody can get on one or more of, or one of the Medicaid waivers, they can provide additional supports. I'm not sure that I understand the connection to advocacy there, but it certainly, the pots of money that are available under Medicaid waiver can really help a person live independently. That is the purpose of the Home and Community-Based Services waiver, as to keep people out of institutions and provide a myriad of services that let them live in communities. So that, yes, expanding that program and programs is helpful for what we're talking about. Any other questions, concerns, thoughts? Okay. Thank you so much. And Judge, I appreciate you coming, and your insight is so helpful from that perspective from the bench as well. So thank you.